This is the OTB Television Network, a service of Capital District Off-Track Betting.
Broadcasting live from the Capital OTB studios, this is Racing Across America with Seth Merrow.
Good morning. Welcome to Racing Across America. We're going to take a look at the Kentucky Derby and also the Derby disqualification controversy, so to speak. Thought we would dedicate a few minutes to this as it is the news story, not just of the week, but probably one of the biggest Derby stories in memory, really, with the disqualification of Maximum Security. We will talk about all of that, certainly, and I thank you for joining us. We also thank our friends at Woodbine for their sponsorship. Woodbine, pick, bet, and cheer on great racing north of the border. Always appreciate their sponsorship. But again, going to take a little bit of a look at the Derby and get some thoughts on that and the disqualification. We'll be joined a little bit later on by John White from Santa Anita. John has spent time in the stewards booth as a steward out in Southern California, some of the other racetrack locations across the country as well. But I thought it would be great to get the viewpoint of a steward, given what happened yesterday at Churchill Downs as we tape on Sunday, and get some of John's thoughts, again, from that steward's type of a perspective. Also, Richard Migliori, a jockey who's ridden in the Derby 5 times, and he's been in that position of claiming foul and having fouls claimed against him, and just wanted to reach out to Rich and get that perspective as well. And then our friend Steve Bick, who was at Churchill Downs for the last couple of weeks, really leading into the Derby with the radio show, Sirius and XM's At the Races. He was obviously at Churchill on Saturday afternoon, and I wanted to get a feel for what the atmosphere was like while the deliberations was going on, and then just get some of his thoughts as well on the disqualification. Also caught up with him getting thoughts on some of the stakes action over the 2 days as well, which was great, and we'll hit on that, as I say. Before we get into the specifics of the disqualification, though, let's just give some general thoughts on the Derby itself. And while we do that, we can take a look at the stretch run. Number 7 is Maximum Security, who will wind up being disqualified. Number 20 is Country House, 65-1, eventual Derby winner for Bill Mott. Excuse me. Number 13 is Code of Honor for Shug and John Velasquez, who runs 3rd. And again, this is how they came under the wire. Tacitus just up over Improbable for 4th, and Game Winner in 6th. And again, those are how they came under the wire. They eventually all moved up one when Maximum Security, who you see veers out there, gets moved down because of that situation. And there was, excuse me, an unprecedented Derby disqualification. But other than that, and before the DQ, this was a pretty popular Derby. The Churchill Downs press notes that came out Saturday night, all-time, all sources handle on the Derby program itself and on the Kentucky Derby race. Also, interesting to note, $4.1 million was bet in Japan. That was due to the entrant from Japan, Master Fencer, that allowed wagering in Japan for the first time on the Derby, and they poured $4.1 million into that record Derby Day handle and Kentucky Derby handle. Attendance went down a little bit, but still pretty good for a day that did feature some weather. 150,729 attended, 150,000, just incredible, show up at Churchill Downs to take in a Kentucky Derby 145. And there was lots of reaction. There was some boos from the crowd. There was stunned silence when the objection went up on the board. And again, we'll hit on that as well. Some of the nice performances over the 2 days, Serengeti Empress obviously with the Oaks win, McKenzie, World of Trouble, and Matoli on the sprint side. World of Trouble on Friday looked great, and I said, well, he put his name on the ballot for an Eclipse Sprint Award this year. But I said Saturday morning, we'll see what Matoli has to say about that. Matoli then looked great on Saturday afternoon. Bricks and Mortar, another life and death finish, but does get up with a great stretch run. She's a Julie looked good. Mia Mischief looked good. Part of the contingent that looked very good for Steve Asmussen, but more importantly, horses that came in. I've talked about this for years. This time of year, I love the horses moving from Oaklawn to other venues. And horses who in their last race had run, and most of these had won, but had run at Oaklawn, 10 of the 27 races, is that the total? Yeah, 10, there were 27 races Friday and Saturday. 10 of those were won by horses who last time out had raced at Oaklawn. And there were some nice prices in there, including, obviously, Country House, who was coming out of a third-place finish in the Arkansas Derby, $132. But also on Saturday, a couple of horses who had last raced at Oaklawn. One at Churchill on Saturday, $28, $25. On Friday, there was one of the winners was $46. So again, it looks like last year I didn't feel that angle was quite as potent as it has been. Maybe that was just a little bit of an aberration. But boy, it seems like watch as this now Oaklawn meet is concluded. Take a look at the horses because, boy, that was a productive angle Friday and Saturday down at Oaklawn. But again, part of that was also Steve Asmussen and his contingent. He had a great afternoon. And as I say, really, really nice racing, stakes racing overall. Unfortunately, the wind came out of our sails a little bit with the disqualification in the Derby. And as we'll see, we pre-tape these interviews, and as we talk to people, my take on it was, I think a lot of the anti-DQ people just, you spend so much time gearing up for the Derby. It's not just, hey, I'm handicapping the night before as on a Wednesday or a Thursday. You start thinking about the Derby months ahead of time, and you get invested. And so when something like this happens, the disqualification, I think just a lot of people were very disappointed. I think that led to a lot of the anti-DQ sentiment, as we'll talk about. But it certainly made news, and we have some of the newspaper headlines, in fact, from around the country, prominent headlines that featured the upset, the DQ, subsequently $134 winner getting moved up on the DQ. And we have various headlines: New York Times, New York Post, Lexington Herald Leader, the LA Times, and the San Diego Union Tribune. As you can see there, wire to wire, then haywire comes from the LA Times. This is the Lexington Herald Leader. Second is best. And that's their front page. These are all front page clips. So the Derby still makes news around the country, and given the situation yesterday, even more so. The New York Post, you always got to expect a little play on words. Nay, it ain't so, from the New York Post on the Sunday morning headline featured there. This was the Joe Drape article on the front page of the New York Times, talking about this being unprecedented. In a first, there's a Derby disqualification. As I say, all front page headlines from across the country. Big news. Some people were happy, some people not so much. Some people, I think, just kind of stepped back like I did, and we'll talk about it in the show. I think they made the right decision. It was a tough decision to make, but I think they made the right decision, and it was a disappointing decision, being racing fans, because Maximus Security, that was just a superb race he ran. So it was a disappointing result. I think they had to do it. A lot of question marks, though. So up next, we'll take a look. The three stewards came out Saturday night in front of the media. Unfortunately, and there was a little buzz about this, they didn't take any questions. They just sat down in front of the media. You're going to see the entire thing. It's only a minute and a half where they read a prepared statement, but they explained their thinking behind the DQ. So up next, the Kentucky stewards talking the Kentucky Derby disqualification.
Them first in the center is Barbara Borden, Chief Steward for the state of Kentucky. And then on the far end, Butch Beecraft, also state of Kentucky steward, as well as Tyler Picklesheimer, Association steward, meaning an employee of Churchill Downs, or appointed by Churchill Downs. Correct. We are not going to have any questions. We're just going to have a statement from Barbara, and that'll be the extent of the proceedings. So Barbara, if you would, the floor is yours.
Hello, good evening. The riders of the 18 and 20 horses in the Kentucky Derby lodged objections against the 7-horse, the winner, due to interference, turning for home, leaving the quarter pole. We had a lengthy review of the race. We interviewed affected riders. We determined that the 7-horse drifted out and impacted the progress of number 1, in turn interfering with the 18 and 21. Those horses were all affected, we thought, by the interference. Therefore, we unanimously determined to disqualify number 7 and place him behind the 18. The 18 being the lowest placed horse that he bothered, which is our typical procedure.
All right, Barbara, thank you for coming down. Butch and Tyler, thank you for coming to meet with us.
Thank you.
And,
Thank you very
if
much.
anybody needs the spelling on those names, you can come up and visit with me, and I can get you the correct spelling.
Thank you.
So there it is, the steward's explanation, and to give you the lowdown on the horses that were involved that she was talking about. The number 18 is Long Range Toddy. Wound up running 17th, but John Court claimed foul, as did Flavian Pratt, the runner-up, Country House, who eventually got moved up. On the NBC broadcast, they mentioned Flavian Pratt. They didn't mention John Court, but according to the stewards, John Court, on the horse that ran 17th, Long Range Toddy, also claimed foul. The horse that really took the worst of it was War of Will, the number 1 horse with Tyler Gaffalione on board. He did not claim foul, but I read subsequently Mark Cassie had talked to him, and he and Cassie, they both had kind of the same thought about it. Why claim? They ran 8th in the race. If they get moved up a spot, it really doesn't affect, there's no bonus for them. So Tyler just didn't claim because it wasn't going to affect his situation or the owner or the trainer in any way. So that's why he didn't claim. But that was what happened. And when the stewards looked eventually, and they also thought Bodie Express was bothered a little bit too. That one finished 14th. But again, they thought Long Range Toddy was among those horses that was bothered, being that he finished 17th. Subsequently, Maximum Security was moved from the first place finish down to number 17. Everybody else moved up because you go behind the horse that was bothered. And there was a few horses. That was the one that was lowest place. So that was the situation. Now we also have some video. We know it's a game of highs and lows, and we're going to take a look here because there were cameras obviously on both Bill Mott and Jason Service right after the race, and as they watched the board. And one of the articles I read said it took 22 minutes. It was a long time the stewards looked at this. But first up, we have Bill Mott. And again, these are just a couple of short videos. We'll watch Bill Mott first. I'll come back and then intro Jason Service. But again, you're going to see the highs and lows of the game, the different reactions. First up, as the disqualification is announced, here's Bill Mott.
So, you can't, no matter how hard you look at it, you just never know sometimes, when they leave the gate and who's going to get, who's going to show that early speed.
How agonizing is this, just waiting?
There you have it. Okay.
So there it is, the highs of the game. Bill Mott gets moved up to a victory in the Kentucky Derby and gets to put that on his resume. The flip side, the other side of the coin, next up, Jason Service, who in the same position is sitting for 20 minutes watching the board and waiting for that announcement to be made. Here's the reaction from Jason Service.
John, what do you think? Did you see it?
It's still taking a long time. I don't think it's a good sign.
You think he deserves to come down?
I didn't think it changed the outcome of the race, no.
Did you think the horse got tired, or what happened? Did you see?
It looked like something scared him on the infield. But like I said, I haven't been able to watch it that close.
He ran fantastic. You're surprised at all?
Yeah, I saw 22, I was worried. 46, but then he was doing this. I thought, well, he's getting a breath, getting a breather.
Yeah. He looked like he was having fun up there. He was going great.
Yeah, I think he likes the mud, too.
John, has he ever worked in the mud before?
Yeah.
Probably waited longer on one of these, Jason.
It's a long one. I don't think that's a good sign.
Try and get it right. Yeah. Too big a race. Too big a race not to.
Yeah. Who was 7-1? Africa?
No, the country house to 20. Mott City doesn't think we got interfered with much that other races did. Win some, lose some?
I feel bad for the West, yeah.
It's all part of it? Just all part of it?
I say I feel bad for the owners, yes.
What do you think happened? Top of the stretch?
Yeah, he did see something that looked like he ducked out a little bit.
Do you think he should have stayed up?
I don't know. I got to look at it. It's hard for me to see with all the cameras.
He said he saw something scared in the infield.
It looked like it. I thought he kind of, drifted out a little bit.
To win the
I got to
Kentucky
get a
Derby,
good look at it.
to win the Kentucky Derby and have it taken away.
Yeah, that's tough. Yeah, that's tough. I hadn't ended yet, but.
There it is, the other side of the coin. Bill Mott very happy. Jason Service obviously very, very disappointed after, boy, you come under the wire and think, hey, I've got a Kentucky Derby, and then 20 minutes later, boom, not so much so. So again, it was a Kentucky Derby story that will go down in Kentucky Derby lore. One of the strangest Derby situations in memory, certainly, and unprecedented as far as a disqualification of a winner on the racetrack like that. And as again, it being such a big story, I thought we'd have a little discussion from some folks who maybe would have some firsthand knowledge. And first up, we'll talk with John White. Again, we talked to him a lot about racing out in Southern California. He's the morning line odds maker out in Southern California, but he has been in the steward's box as a steward at various points throughout his career. So John White up next, talking a little bit about the DQ from his perspective, having been in the steward's booth in, as I say, various points throughout his career. John's up next. Joined now by John White. We catch up with him when we talk a little Santa Anita, Southern California racing, but I thought with this discussion, John has been in the steward's booth at some tracks out there on the West Coast, so who better to reach out to and talk a little bit about the Derby DQ? John, good morning.
Good morning, Seth. Yes, I've worked as a steward in Washington State, Idaho, and California. So, and that goes back to 1979 when I first worked as a steward at the age of 24, one of the youngest stewards in the history of horse racing.
So, as I say, nobody better to reach out to get some opinion on this. And for Equidaily, last night and early this morning, I was linking to some articles, and it seems like the articles seem to be against the DQ, but I have a feeling a lot of those are sports writers who just aren't familiar with horse racing. Subsequently, I linked to Brisnet put up a list of racing Twitter comments, and these were real racing people, and they were kind of split 50-50. But what I noted was you were either, well, it broke the rules, and so the horse had to come down, or the argument on the other side for it shouldn't come down was mainly kind of, well, it's the Derby. But my feeling is I think you got to go with the rules either way. So I'm tilting towards the DQ. But again, as somebody who's been in the steward's booth, give us your take on the situation yesterday.
Well, first of all, Seth, to me, the most important thing was that could have been an absolute disaster because, and particularly in the climate of what has happened at Santa Anita this year, horse racing right now was under the microscope, and the last thing we needed was in the Kentucky Derby, the biggest race in the country, to have some sort of wreck. And we were perilously close to that happening there when maximum security did shift out, and there's no question he shifted out. He did not stay in his path, so that's element number one. He shifted out. I think most people, whether you think it was a good call or a bad call, you're going to say, yes, a foul occurred. So then it just gets into where, like you say, where some people say, well, it's a big race, so you should let it stay. Or some people will say, well, it didn't really affect maybe a horse's better placing. But honestly, Seth, and I have to say, when I first saw it and was watching it, look, Laura Will was my pick in the race. And he was bottled up turning for home, and I was hoping perhaps Tyler Gaffalione would stay a little more patient because a lot of times horses will drift out turning for home. A lot of times the centrifugal force or they're tiring a bit, they'll come off that fence and an opening will occur. So I was kind of hoping Tyler, but he had so much horse and he had nowhere to go. He was bottled up, and I was afraid Tyler was going to force his way out and cause problems. He got out of there without causing problems, but the moment he got out, that was when maximum security did shift out more than a lane. And the rider, Saya, says it was the crowd noise. That certainly is plausible. Also, some people have speculated it could have been a puddle on the track. Yeah. That's possible. Also, there's a hedge to the inside there that he could have shied from. That's possible. It could have been any of those or a combination. But the point is he did come out. And the more I looked at this, the more I realized that this was a situation that he should come down, mainly because multiple horses were impacted by the incident. When you start to having that many, it wasn't just Warville, but you had Long Range Toddy, you had Bodie Express. When I slowed it down and played it, I even think Cutting Humor was affected to some extent, not strongly, but he had to go much wider than he was going to because of all this action toward his inside. So the point is that what maximum security did certainly impacted the finish of the race. Well, then this morning I read at the Blood Horse where they quoted the rule, the Kentucky Horse Racing Commission's rule, and it says that if, in the opinion of the stewards, a foul alters the finish of a race, an offending horse may be disqualified by the stewards. Now, I would submit when you have that many horses being impacted to the extent that they were, it did, quote, alter the finish of the race. So if you go by the rule and what happened turning for home, to me, it warrants a disqualification. Now, the point of that rule here, or a point of it is, and you learn this as a steward, Seth, when you go through rule books, two of the most important words are may and shall. And it doesn't say that a horse here in this rule shall be disqualified. It says the horse may be disqualified, which means it is in the judgment of the stewards. So you could have had a situation where the stewards say, you know what, in our judgment, we feel that this did not warrant a disqualification, and they could have ruled that way. And that's partly why this is so controversial. It was a judgment call. But to me, when you consider what happened there, it just really, I feel that the more I looked at it, I switched from thinking, you know what, I don't see how you would take this horse down, to I would take that horse down. I think they made the correct call. Now, would it have been better if the inquiry sign had been up? Yes. But I think what happened is that the objections were lodged quickly enough that they posted the objections and they wanted to get right to that videotape. But certainly it would look better for the stewards if they had put the inquiry sign up. Another aspect of this that has been strongly criticized is it took approximately 22 minutes for the stewards to render their decision. A lot of people say, well, that when it takes that long, you should leave it. And so I will say that I generally am of that philosophy. In fact, in a lot of races in my career as a steward, I've told my other two stewards, if we've gone like past 5 or 6 minutes, I say, look, if we have to keep looking at this long, it's telling us that we don't have a clear-cut decision here, and we should not make a disqualification. We should let the race be settled on the racetrack. But I think the extenuating circumstance here, and why I'm not that critical of the stewards taking so long, is that there were multiple horses involved, and they had to go through horse by horse. And you had a very, bunched field turning for home. They had to go through there with a fine-tooth comb and see who got bothered, how much they got bothered, because then they had to determine if they're going to disqualify Maximum Security, how far down do we put him? And according, again, to the Kentucky rules, I think they made the correct call, because the horse that was involved in the incident that finished the lowest was Long Range Toddy. Is it a shame? Yes. I mean, there's no question. I think everybody can agree Maximum Security was the best horse. I think even Bill Mott and Flavian Pratt would probably agree with that. Country House may have been slightly bumped in his hindquarters. I mean, he was essentially not affected by this, and he gets what we call kissed into the victory, and it's very unsatisfying. It leaves kind of a bad taste in your mouth. But if you go by the rules, I mean, yes, Maximum Security was the best horse, but you have to win the race within the rules. If you go by the rules, he did not win the race fair and square, hence he deserved to be disqualified.
I'm right with you in that as I watched the race, and I was watching on NBC, I took off at the end of the day here. I was doing the TV in the afternoon, but we were done by then, so I was watching the NBC broadcast. And I think Randy and Jerry, I got the feeling by the end of the broadcast they may have switched a little bit too.
I think you're totally. I got that same impression. That in the beginning, I think they both felt that there should be no disqualification, and when just before they signed off, you could tell. Bailey said, yes, Maximum Security is the best horse. He kept saying that. Again, I think we can all agree that, but that really is something of being irrelevant here in terms of, he committed a foul. I think even the people that want to say that he shouldn't have been disqualified, they'll agree he committed a foul. I mean, he did not stay in his path, and he committed a foul. And so then you just get into this murky area. Well, do you just leave it because it's the Kentucky Derby? Well, I don't think that's right, because honestly, I think every race should be judged the same. I really do. One of the things when I was a steward at a smaller track, say like up at LeBois Park in Idaho, listen, those races are just as important to those people participating as the people that were running in the Kentucky Derby yesterday. I mean, in some extent, it could be even more because they're just trying to eke out a measly living, with small purses and so forth. So I don't see how you can just say, well, it's the Kentucky Derby. Look, the precedent had been set. This was not the first time, despite what's being written even in today's Los Angeles Times and elsewhere, this was not the first disqualification for interference in the history of the Kentucky Derby. In 1984, Gate Dancer finished fourth and was disqualified and placed fifth for causing severe interference to poor Fally Time, who got absolutely annihilated coming all the way down the stretch. And you'll remember how Gate Dancer was so famous for lugging in, and they had the earmuffs on him, and he lugged in and just absolutely creamed Fally Time numerous times coming down the stretch. And it was to such an extent that was the first disqualification for interference in the history of the Kentucky Derby, and the only one until yesterday. And yesterday was the first one for a winner. There had previously been a disqualification of a winner in the Kentucky Derby, but that was 1968 when Dancer's image came out of the race with his test showing that he had raced with Butte. And at that time, you were not to race with Butte in your system, and he was disqualified. That got fought in court for many years, but has been held up, and to this day, Forward Pass is the official winner of that 1968 Kentucky Derby.
Yeah, and one of my contentions is we may have had that same situation if they had not moved with the DQ. If they had said no DQ, I could see this one going to court and getting decided 6 months or a year down the road. Because, again, I think, as you say, everybody who looks at it, I think, is going to agree it's a foul. And I think that's why there is the anti-DQ sentiment, because this potentially was a great story, racing-wise. The favorite wins the Kentucky Derby. He's now undefeated and heads to the Preakness. That's something we'd all be able to root for and get behind, and it would be a fun story over the next few weeks. And so it just took the wind out of our sails. But ultimately, if you look and it's a foul, and it would have been a foul on a Thursday in a claiming race, you either have to call it, or I think you have to change the rules for the Kentucky Derby. But given that the rules are what they are, I think had they said no DQ, as it is, the Wests are saying they may appeal this, but I certainly could see the connections of Country House appealing on a non-DQ. And if it goes to court and you have a judge looking and not being a racing person, maybe bringing some stewards in, and every steward who looks says, well, yeah, that's a foul, then as I say, I could see 6 months or a year down the road that it getting decided in the courts, which again would take the wind out of the sails of horse racing.
Well, fortunately, Seth, horse racing has addressed this, and what I mean by that is when I worked as a steward back in the day, a lot of times if you disqualified a horse, or sometimes even if you didn't, it would get appealed. And then these appeals would go before racing commissioners or hearing officers or so forth that had very little expertise in terms of determining whether a call was correct or not. It's not like you were going before another board of stewards with the expertise to make a call. And that does not serve the best interest of racing because of the fact, let's say hypothetically that this was appealed and they overturned it, and then you make Maximum Security the winner of yesterday's Kentucky Derby. Well, the people that bet on this race and bet on Maximum Security, they're not getting any relief, and they just have an even more sour taste in their mouth. In other words, it's in the best interest of racing that once these calls are made, that you move on, and most jurisdictions have addressed this in their rules. And according to the Blood Horse article I read today, Kentucky is in that mold, and that Kentucky rules say stewards' findings of fact and rulings on matters occurring and incident to the running of the race shall be final and not subject to appeal. So they can go ahead and file an appeal, but this will absolutely, according to that rule, go nowhere. And even if it went into a court and a judge, the first thing would defer to the commission that made the rule, the intent of the rule. And the intent of that rule is that, look, whether people agree or disagree with a disqualification or a non-disqualification, it's final, and we're moving on. And as I say, honestly, I believe that is definitely in the best interest of racing.
Yeah, I agree. That's interesting. I'll ask you one other thing. As opposed to a Thursday claiming race, and I don't know whether this is true. I have to get in touch with somebody at Churchill, but if you were watching the broadcast yesterday, you probably saw exactly the same thing. Very often at most tracks, if you have a foul occur on the turn, it becomes very tough to adjudicate because you don't get the kind of a nice shot, you don't get that head-on shot. But boy, they had some camera angles yesterday, and I'm curious whether those are normal Churchill angles or whether they add cameras for Derby Day or they somehow use NBC cameras, because there was some shots there. There was a shot, and again, this occurred on the turn, but it looked almost like a head-on shot at one point. They dropped a shot in where you saw Maximum Security come out, and as I say, being on the turn, it was very unique. So I have to find out what the situation is down there on a normal day, camera-wise, video-wise, because boy, they had that covered. And again, normally it's hard to see on a turn to be able to adjudicate, but they had all kinds of angles yesterday that made it clear. Yeah, it made it clear, just kind of plain as day.
Well, you make an excellent point there, Seth. Excellent point. And believe me, I looked at some of those shots and just was lamenting how I would just practically give my right arm when I've been a steward at some tracks that don't have anywhere close to that kind of quality video coverage of a race. In fact, I've said many times, if you want the best adjudicated racing in terms of the best calls, always have a blimp. And evidently they didn't have a blimp yesterday because I have not seen any blimp shots.
Right,
And
yeah.
imagine if they'd had a blimp for that and what that would have showed, because I think a blimp would have probably really shown what happened there and really shown.
I wonder if the weather kept the blimp on the
Well,
ground.
it probably did,
yeah.
and it's a shame because a blimp would, I think, be very illuminating in this situation. But as you say, Seth, they had excellent camera coverage as it was. I think back to one time in the 1990s when I was at LeBois Park in Idaho as a steward, and we did not take a horse down, and the trainer came in the next morning and was just spitting nails and fuming, and I said, look, honestly, I think maybe the horse should have been disqualified, and we didn't take him down. But let me show you the video that we had to deal with. I took him into our office and I showed him one shot of the head on, and he said, "Oh my goodness!" He said, "I feel sorry for you guys. I was going to appeal this, and now I'm not going to." That's how bad our video coverage was at LeBois Park. The guy took one look at this and said, because I'm telling you, they were hiring camera people like out of banks for like $20 a day that didn't even know what they were doing. And you would put your pen. One of the tricks I've learned when you say like horses running on a straightaway, a trick I was taught many years ago. You take a pen or a pencil and put it on the screen and put it where the horse is as they're running down the stretch. And and you can use the harrow tracks to this extent too, but a pen can really help. And you put the pen there, but every time I would put the pen on the screen, the guy would jerk the camera, and then I'd have to move the pen, and he'd jerk the camera, and it was fuzzy. And as I say, the guy felt so sorry. He said, I'm going from being mad at you to feeling sorry for you.
And that was the beauty, again, of yesterday, because, again, it's oftentimes hard to tell on the turn. Did a horse shift past? But it was clear yesterday.
It was clear. There's just no question. I mean, it was more than even one path, too. I mean, this horse, and look, Saez admitted it, and even Service after the race, he said he ducked out. I mean, it's clear this horse came out. So that's element number one. It wasn't like did he or didn't he. It is clear. And as you say, Seth, that can be murky sometimes. We had the San Felipe with McKenzie involved in a deal there where people were trying to figure out what happened turning for home. And in most cases, that is the toughest place in terms of making a call as a steward, is that on the turns, particularly turning for home. But that really, because of the excellent camera coverage at Churchill Downs for the Kentucky Derby, that really was not the case. And I think the excellent camera coverage bolsters the feeling that by a lot of people that the stewards did make the right call. Like I say, it's a shame they didn't put the inquiry up, for one thing, and it's a shame they're being criticized because they took so long. But listen, the length of the inquiry is irrelevant to whether you make a good or bad decision. The important thing is to make a good decision. And look, they had to talk to the jockeys, and they had to go through all of those horses that were sitting in that pack, turning for home, to try to determine who got bothered. So that takes time. I mean, you're not going to do that in like 3 or 4 minutes. So I think it's quite reasonable that they took approximately 22 minutes. But, the people that have never been in those shoes are certainly going to be critical of that. And as I say, generally, I feel like if it takes you that long, you don't want to make a disqualification, but it shows you that in this case, because multiple horses were impacted by the actions of Maximum Security, I believe he should have had his number taken down, and it's a shame. He was the best horse. It's a shame. It's too bad, and we would have had an undefeated horse going to the Preakness Stakes, but you can't. Seth, I've said this more times than I can remember when I've had to be with my colleagues, and we talk to the jockeys the next day on these incidents of a disqualification or no disqualification. And I've told so many riders, the more you stay straight, the more you stay in your path, the less trouble you're going to get into. And anytime you stray off your path, you are raising the possibility that you could get disqualified. Sometimes you're not going to get disqualified because you get bailed out because it didn't affect the order of finish in the judgment of the stewards. But you're just lucky when that happens. The more you can stay straight, the less trouble you're going to get into. And certainly Maximum Security did not stay in his path.
Yeah, and again, I was with you when I first saw it. and listening to Jerry Bailey and Randy Moss. I was with them. Best horse won. Probably wouldn't do anything as a steward, as they showed it over and over, and you saw the legs kind of get tangled, as you say, on the verge of something very bad happening. You realize this has got to come down. And as I say, as I go out and look on the internet, I was a little bit surprised that there was so much of a division and so many non-DQ, but I think a lot of that just comes down to, as we've alluded to in the conversation, I think it's just a disappointing way to end up a race that everybody spends months and months talking about.
Well, you want the race to be settled on the track, and as a steward, that's my philosophy. Believe me, all things being equal, I don't want to get involved, and my happiest days as a steward are when it's a safe day, and when we had no controversy, no DQs, and it was a nice, quiet day, and we just had a good day of racing. But look, as I say, they came very close. This was perilously close to a disaster turning for home, because if War of Will, and there are some photos that show, his legs are practically like in between the hind legs of Maximum Security. He's so lucky he didn't clip heels. And believe me, when you clip a horse's heels, it just you clip them and you often stumble, and a lot of times the horse and or rider fall. And if War of Will falls at that point, you're looking at just a complete disaster there. And the last thing this sport of horse racing needed on that big of a stage was a big wreck turning for home. Yes, we have the controversy here. Was it a disqualification that was merited or not? But that pales into comparison to what we could have been dealing with today. If we get multiple horses going down and hurt and jockeys going down and getting hurt, that just would have been the last thing this sport needed. And so I say thank goodness that didn't happen. I think the fates were kind of smiling down on us. It was already kind of a tough derby from my perspective, because my pick in the race, Scratched, he had tripped epiglottis, and I think he would have been right there personally with a Maximum Security. Maximum Security got a 101 Buyer's speed figure, and that's exactly what Omaha Beach got in the Arkansas Derby. So I don't think there's any. Omaha Beach was 2 for 2 on sloppy tracks. And where I got on his bandwagon was at Santa Anita in his maiden win, where he opened up 10 lengths on the far turn and won by 9 lengths in a 7-furlong maiden race. So, it to me already was kind of a downer derby to have Omaha Beach, the morning line favorite, scratched and not be able to compete. But then we have this controversy. But again, to have controversy is nothing compared to what we would be dealing with today. If we'd had a big wreck turning for home, and we were very close to having a big wreck, a big pileup like you see on the freeway when you get multiple cars. They were very close to that happening in that race, and thank goodness that didn't happen.
Yeah, all we have to deal with is the controversy, and that will keep things very lively between now and Preakness, and it's going to be interesting to see how it all shakes out over the next week or so. But as I said at the top, John, I thought nobody better to reach out to as you've been in the steward's booth and get some opinions from you on what happened in the Derby. I know this is a race day as we tape at Santa Anita, so we'll let you get off the phone and head over to the racetrack for some racing out on the West Coast. But again, we appreciate the thoughts and the conversation. We'll talk again.
Thanks a lot, Seth.
John White, again, you see him, and we talked to him a lot about Southern California racing out at Santa Anita, but I thought we'd reach out to him with this controversy, as he has been in the steward's booth in the past, and had a good conversation. Appreciate it. Thanks to John White. And again, he was very similar to me. I first looked at it, he thought, it's the Derby, and the best horse won. And I think that the broadcast, Jerry Bailey and Randy Moss were like that. But as you look more and more, it was hard to fathom that this horse, shouldn't come down if you're sticking to the rules, as disappointing as it was. But maybe a little bit of a different perspective. Up next, we'll talk to Richard Migliori, longtime New York-based jockey. Spent some time out in Southern California as well. I believe over 4,000 wins in the career, but he also rode in 5 Kentucky Derbies. So I thought it'd be nice to get a perspective from somebody who's out there on the racetrack and has been in those kind of situations, tight situations where you claim foul or you get foul claimed against you. So here are some thoughts on yesterday's Derby disqualification coming up from Richard McGlory.
Doesn't come down because they didn't hang an inquiry up. So somebody's dropping the ball somewhere.
I'll toss it in. You kind of alluded to it. The John Court claiming foul. He came under the finish line 17th, and people are saying, why didn't Tyler Gaffleone claim foul? Well, Mark Cassidy said he talked with Tyler and essentially agreed. War of Will came under the line 8th, and they said, hey, we move up one spot. It doesn't help us anyway. As a jockey, is there, the years you've done it, is there that kind of a thinking in races normally where, you know what, I may have gotten fouled at some point in the race, but I wound up 8th. If I claim foul, it's not going to make a difference anyway.
Yeah, I think there is like a silent code of ethics about that. You're not going to help your owner or trainer or the betting public by claiming foul. It's not going to change the amount of purse money your horse gets, so why should I rain on somebody else's parade? If I felt like somebody did something that egregious, I wouldn't claim foul, but then, you would have to deal with it, man to man back in the jockey's room, like, hey, what happened here, and figure it out. But to claim, I don't know, it just seems to me, again, no doubt, letter of the law, he bothered some horses. I've seen rough run derbies for as long as I can remember. I know this looked dramatic, but I just personally think the best horse won, and I would have liked the results there.
And just before we let you go, take us through, because I always find this interesting, and I wish this was a little more transparent to fans, but you'll know, because you've been behind the scenes in the jockey's room, a jockey dealing with the stewards, and I know you mentor some younger jockeys as well in situations like this, perhaps. But what happens the next day? We hear about, the jocks will go in and look at films with the stewards and whatnot. In this particular situation, what was likely to happen this morning?
Well, they'll have a hearing, go over the disqualification, and then make a decision whether they should give Luis Saez a suspension or not. Now, for the first incident, I would not suspend him, and that was when he bothered War of Will and Long Range Toddy marginally. But for the second incident, when he pulled over back on top of Johnny Velasquez, and I'll be honest, I kind of missed it yesterday. It wasn't until today, back in the video trucks preparing to do the Fox show, that I got to watch it closely, and I went, wow, he really kind of turned Code of Honor a little bit sideways, trying to close the door because Johnny had already gotten in there. I would actually give him 5 days for that.
Rich, we know you got to get out and get back to work. We appreciate the visit, though. As I said, we wanted to get some thoughts on somebody who's actually been there. And again, it's going to be interesting over the next week or two to see how things shake out heading to the Preakness. But again, appreciate your thoughts.
Thank you. Good talking with you guys.
Richard Migliore. Thanks, Rich Migliore, for taking the time. And again, interesting, different perspective. And that's kind of, if you look out and look at the opinions, the difference of opinion, John White to Richard Migliore, and that's kind of what it seems like. There's a real split here. It was a foul. They had to make the call. It was the right call. It was the Derby, and let's leave things up and let the best horse win. Steve Bick's up next. He's going to have some comments. And again, we taped this previously, and he's where I am, where I'm kind of, it's mixed emotions. I kind of thought that the DQ was right, but it's disappointing that it happened in a race like that, in all the circumstances and whatnot. But Steve was down there, and we got some thoughts as well on what the atmosphere was like at Churchill with that kind of 20-minute delay as they deliberated. Really kind of a bizarre situation as compared to normal circumstances when it comes to the Derby. So up next, Steve Bick. Joined now by Steve Bick. He was down at Churchill for a couple of weeks with the radio show, Sirius and XM's At the Races, doing great coverage, as always, leading into the Kentucky Derby. But I thought we'd reach out and get somebody who was live on the ground on Saturday afternoon for one of the weirdest derbies in memory, certainly. Steve, good afternoon.
Seth, hey.
Give me a little feel, before we talk specifics, just give me a little feel for what it was like. I was watching on TV, and so obviously there was a different atmosphere because they were commenting, Jerry Bailey and Randy Moss, and we were seeing the replays over and over again. But give me a feel for what it was like down there, where they come under the wire, and now we have a potential undefeated horse heading on to the Preakness. It was the second favorite, so obviously the crowd wound up with a lot of winning tickets in and amongst that 150,000 people. But then when that objection sign went up, and as time clicked away, what was the feeling there at Churchill?
It was odd, obviously. there was no
stretch. He impeded
there
the
was
one-horse
no
War of
immediate
Will.
knowledge within, I don't know, must have been, time elapses strangely in that setting, but it didn't immediately become evident that there was the objection. And from that standpoint, and especially because now you're in, this mass of people heading toward either the winner's circle or going across the track. I really didn't have any interest in going across the track this year. A lot of times I'll watch it from the last several years. I've watched the race from on the grass, across from the cupola, but it really, you had no idea. And certainly watching it live with the pan shot, looking up at the big screen, you couldn't necessarily tell that there had been much of an incident. The whole lead group was so well bunched, which was very odd in a race on a wet track. Usually horses will spread out. The spray will give horses and riders a tendency to leave a lot of room in between, and a string, the horses will string out. The field won't stay bunched. This field stayed shockingly bunched. And so, off the turn where there was the scrum, you really had no way of knowing. And then when they start showing replays, you realize there is really something here to look at. So, the information wasn't flowing too well either, because it was never made apparent that John Court on Long Range Toddy had also filed an objection. That didn't come out till later on, but he had, in fact, asked the outriders to hold the official up. So the tension starts to mount, and I couldn't even, from where I had started, I couldn't even get down toward the winner's circle and the track apron. I had been with Mrs. Weber watching with the win-win-win team with Mike Trombetta and his dad and wife and kids and that group. So it was right away it was reminiscent of that Santa Anita handicap when Mandela and Baffert had to wait it out. The Game On Dude, remember that one?
Yes.
That is very similar to that. That was the first thing that I thought of, and I after a while I actually started to. I told Tina, because we had to start our way home. I said he's coming down, and so we started to move, to get out, and it still hadn't gone official when we were, trying to get out of there.
Give me your take. I mean, I was watching on NBC, and Randy Moss and Jerry Bailey, when they first showed it, said, best horse won the race. It's the Derby. I wouldn't change anything. I got the feeling as time went along, as did I, and more replays were available. And that was one thing. Boy, they had some angles there that you wouldn't get on the normal Thursday when we refer to that in this situation. But it just became apparent when you took a look and a closer look that this was a foul and that they were going to have to do something here. But last night on Equidaily, I went out and linked to a lot of opinion pieces, which I think for the most part were written by sports writers who weren't necessarily racing fans. But you followed racing Twitter. There's a split. There are a lot of people who are kind of should have come down. It was clear foul, and other people who are it's the Derby, and so the best horse won and leave it the way it was. After looking and looking again last night, I'm of the opinion it was a foul. I think they made the right decision. What was your takeaway from yesterday?
I had to go on Sirius literally 5 minutes after it was official, and what I said was, it's the right call, but that doesn't make it good. Did the winner come out, and did he drift out, and if you want to call it herd, if you want to say that he stack up the three horses that were abreast of him, he did. Was it instrumental in preventing them from advancing further? That's always the question. There's also a part of this that has to bring War of Will moving into a spot that wasn't necessarily there, that also contributed to what then becomes a bit of a much more evident incident. If wholly owned isn't going into that spot, then perhaps we don't get the little bit of the chain reaction. So I've got such mixed feelings because I hate when bettors are penalized by having the best horse. I mean, clearly the horse that ran the best race taken down. And Maximum Security was spectacular. I mean, he ran an absolute brilliant race. The beneficiary, obviously, of the DQ ran a very nice race, and a relentless race, and got a great ride from Flavian Pratt, and a horse that clearly benefited from the wet track and relished the going. He wasn't winning that race, however. If Maximum Security doesn't come over and Warren's Will has all the room that he needs and everything else, Bodie Express and Long Range Toddy, they're not beating him. That's the problem with this. And everybody's saying, oh, a normal Thursday he probably comes down. A normal Thursday you wouldn't have had 32 cameras covering the race either. And you brought that point up, and that's a tremendous point. That you would have had your head on, you would have had your hand shot, and that would have been it. And this is a really awkward, to me, a very awkward scenario, because I don't think anybody really benefited from this. I know that Bill Mott deserves to get up here, and he more or less was saying the right thing. He called it a no-brainer. I don't think it was a no-brainer. I think it took some real serious consideration to make this decision, and in Kentucky, that is an incident that will generally result, almost always result, in a takedown. The difference here is there are some circumstances, including how that racetrack was even as wet and muddy as it was, because for some reason it was arrowed at a point when it should have been sealed, and that allowed all kinds of water to get in that racetrack. It had all kinds to say this is kind of an incidental scenario. I was going to, you and I discussed these a lot. I am comfortable pretty much when they're 50-50. It doesn't matter to me which way they go. And this one, because of the glare and because of the spotlight and the importance, is going to get extra consideration. But to me, it's really, what we deal with day to day. You get taken down, you get put up, you just live with it. I'm comfortable personally with the decision. I feel terrible for Gary West and Ben Glass and the entire team associated with Maximum Security because he was the best horse. And if he doesn't drift out there, I'm sure the wall of noise that they get hit with contributed. Startles him and loses focus for a second. That's all it takes. So we've seen that in the last 3 months. We've had the NFL with the non-pass interference. We've had the NBA and the NCAA with a bevy of bad officiating. And then we had just, last week, you had a game stolen from the Las Vegas Golden Knights with a call that became immediately apparent in the aftermath. And with the benefit of added video, it became apparent that the 5-minute major was a terrible call. So, what do you do? Nothing. You make the decision, and that's the decision. There's not a lot else to really do. I would prefer to have won one on the square with his horse pulling away with winning, but they won this. They were in position to win, and you got to give Pratt some credit for noticing that there was an issue and putting in an objection. Because if he doesn't open his mouth, I think this thing probably becomes official real quick.
Yeah, that's a great point, too. I totally agree with that. Although John Court claimed, which even on the NBC broadcast wasn't brought out immediately, and so I think that may have confused people as well. But I'm in the same boat you are, where, and I think a lot of people, even people who feel strongly one way or the other, still can kind of see the other side in that, it's the Derby, and it's a race normal race you start handicapping the night before. The Derby you start handicapping in January, and certainly get down to it on Tuesday. And so you get the potential there for an undefeated horse to go on to the Preakness. As racing fans, we like that. And so I think it's disappointing that it happened, but it was the right decision. But it's just you hate to see it happen in that situation. So I think everybody is kind of conflicted on it.
Exactly. It's an unsatisfying result, essentially, because it's not, it's not definitive. And even though Country House gets put up, the horse he was fairly involved in the thing. I mean, that's part of this that when we get these cues where you get horses that were directly affected and finished second to get put up, you feel that that's a rightful result. But when a horse gets kissed in that, that just happened to finish second, that if they ran the race, 30 times, they might not win. That's not a satisfying conclusion. The horses that were most directly affected, essentially, I don't have a lot of sympathy for Gasquillon in this situation because he was trying to force himself between who was it? Bodie. Was it Bodie? No, Bodie was outside of Long Range Toddy. I mean, he was basically trying to knife through with three horses to his outside and one horse to his inside in one of the most difficult places to make a move on a racetrack. I mean, you're coming off a turn. You want to start your momentum, okay, but I mean, obviously, Code of Honor. Look at Johnny. Johnny was in the place you'd never find him on the inside. Nobody was smarter than him. So, the reason you can say it's different because of the Derby is because of the amount of horses and the traffic issues. Every single year in this race, if you want to start getting, hyper technical, start going to the beginning of the race with probably 7 fouls when the gates open, into the first turn where guys get mauled. So to make this the hill to die on, I'm sorry. That's what's a little bit of a struggle here, and this is where the Jason Service Bill Bott equation is going to be played out to death. That Boston, Jason Service. Everybody put a black hat on Jason Service. It's a little that part of it. People wouldn't know who's wearing white hats and who's wearing black hats in this game if you gave them a microscope.
Let's just shift attention because again you were down there for the week and a couple of weeks doing the lead into the Derby, and again great work there on Sirius XM. I know there was a lot of great feedback and whatnot. We talked to people here at Derby seminar night here at the Racebook, and folks had been listening and enjoying. So again, great work there. But just overall, take the DQ out of the equation a little bit and just give us overall thoughts on the Derby, and from a perspective also of, I've been talking for the last few weeks thinking this was a lot like last year, where the Triple Crown eventually kind of exposed that early season crop, except, of course, for Justify. But did the Derby do that a little bit this year as well? I mean, Maximum Security has kind of stepped forward. But if the three Baffert horses are out of the mix, and well, give us your thoughts.
Whoa. Wait,
go.
It's a wet track. It's a quagmire.
Okay.
You don't know anything about these horses. All we know is that Country House absolutely loved it. Everybody knew that Code of Honor was going to move up on a wet track. And there's not a lot else to say. Then there's all these horses that absolutely, watch the replay. Go ahead and watch it, 19 times. Watch one horse each time, and you'll see who absolutely had no chance. Win, for instance. You can see the first time, first of all, he gets clobbered out of the gate and is on his heels immediately, and then he's climbing and not enjoying it. Pat never picked up his feet and enjoyed the going. It's meaningless. It's a complete roulette. It's 19 horse roulette, and you get what you get in here. You want the horses that ran great. Improbable was bottled up for much of the race, and I don't think he was enjoying the going. He and Maximum Security are the only horses really that were on the pace that more or less stayed on. Warren Will, I mean, okay, you're going to talk about the incident. He was beaten, 5 lengths, 4 lengths. But really, you look at the start, and you've got horses, like Tacitus and Game Winner and Master Fencer. Master Fencer was shot out of a cannon late. I mean, he really ran after, basically biding his time. So you have a lot of things going on here. This race didn't collapse, quote unquote, behind Maximum Security, but you had the horses that were mid-pack. Country House and Code of Honor got tremendous rides from both Pratt and from Johnny B. And Tacitus, I think, is a Belmont horse, and we heard that from a few people very young said the horse you want for Belmont is probably Tacitus. So we'll see. To me, the jury's out. I mean, there's a lot of horses here that physically look terrific, and let's get them back on a dry, fast track and let them run a fair race.
Yeah, I had Tacitus on top, and I thought he ran well, so I certainly looking forward to seeing him as we progress along here, and I'm certainly looking forward to see what they do decide to do with Maximum Security. Curious if they will move on to the Preakness or sit out, but it's going to be fun to see what does happen, hopefully getting a dry track moving forward. Let's get some thoughts on the rest of the weekend. The Oaks, Serengeti Empress, World of Trouble also on Friday. I said on Saturday morning he might have put his name on the ballot for the Eclipse Award for Sprinter, and being so versatile, maybe he has an edge. But I said Saturday morning, let's see what Matoli has to say about that, and he wound up looking very good. Bricks and Mortar is turning out to be kind of a life and death horse. He gets up late again. I thought She's a Julie looked very good. Speaking of which, one of the stories that I kind of was picking up on, because I like this angle at this time of year anyway, horses who last raced at Oaklawn won, I think, 8, maybe 9 of the races over Friday and Saturday, including Country House. Cummings the day before, the big price. Saturday early on, there were a couple of $25 winners who had last raced at Oaklawn. Some of those obviously being Asmussen horses, but the Oaklawn shippers were doing very well. Overall, what were your thoughts on the weekend?
Well, you hit one of the highlights. Obviously, Matoli's performance and McKenzie's, among the older horses, short and long, those were both spectacular. If Matoli is now going to become a horse able to race, and there were 2 questions for me in there. Was he going to get into some sort of a pace battle with Thomas's Fulfilled? If that was going to happen, you wanted to look to horses behind the speed. And in fact, I was all over Bobby's Wicked One from Al Stahl, and I thought he was going to have a specific trip behind the speed. Instead, he kind of became the speed. And here's Matoli sitting comfortably behind Promises Fulfilled and Bobby's Wicked One, and then pounces and falls off. I mean, that was spectacular. I talked to Scott Blobby this morning, and they're going to go to the Met, which should be pretty entertaining, especially if McKenzie is going to turn back. And Mike Smith did not have the greatest of weekends riding per se, but the ride on McKenzie was pretty cagey. To let those horses basically go by you, and to then, engage, and the minute you could see, the minute he produced McKenzie, and McKenzie just inhaled them. And last Sunday, we watched all the Derby workouts, and then the first horse on the track after the Derby workout session, the end of the 7:45, McKenzie came out and he turned in the work of the day. We talked about that extensively, and then he delivered in the afternoon. Yeah, you talk about the 2 stat winners yesterday. One question: how did that Digital Age go off at 8-1? That was nuts. I mean, and I guess that's sort of the testimony for a 12, 13, 14 horse field, because he obviously got lost on the board. He was terrific and is a star among the 3-year-olds. And Bricks and Mortar, what a nice testament it is to owner, trainer, patience, and communication. Because Seth Klarman said, take whatever time you need and look what you end up with. Seth, no rush being back. took their time. Now they've got this devastating and efficient turf horse that can go really. It looks like he's going to be versatile from a mile to God knows how long. He's a absolute push button terror, and that was quite a performance. I thought that how about being Michigan coming back again this year and winning again on Derby Day? Well, Askerson had an amazing weekend. I mean, just it's not just the stakes here. What, three great ones? 3 great ones, I think, in the Grade 2, and then they had the rotation won the nightcap yesterday. They had that Hata or whatever the hell it was, whatever that horse was. I think he won the nightcap both days, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Who else? How about there was others? Oh, Mr. Money. I tell you, my best performance. My betting weekend came again this year in the Pate Mile. Absolutely loved the Dickie Foley and the Hot Creek Hustle, and hooked them up and had got everything in there. That was terrific, and Instagram is never a factor, but that was a terrific spot. It was just the racing was great. What wasn't there to like? Will Trouble, you mentioned, a horse that obviously, when there's some give in the turf, he obviously moves even further up than he does on dirt or on a good firm turf. That's the second time he circled with cut in the ground and he explodes. I mean, he was in control, cruise to the top of the lane, wasn't even asked, and everybody else was being asked. They're going to go to the Striper, which is, I don't know, Michael Dove swears that he thinks he's a better horse on turf. I don't know if I'm convinced. I think I'd like to see him try the Met Mile, but I think they're going to go Striper. So it was a great 2 days and a great week, actually. The only thing that you can complain about is the weather and, ending up with a fairly frustrating result in the Derby and a race that is going to go down in its history as one of the probably. I think you probably make it. I suppose it's the second or third. Well, it might even be the most controversial Derby ever. Put up 1957 with Gallant Man with Shoemaker misjudging the finish line. And of course, General Duke scratching on Friday for the race. Throw in Dancer's Image in 1978, the medication. How about 1933, the Fighting Finish, broke his hip. What else we got for controversial Derby?
I don't know, but I think with the DQ, this is going to go up to number 1 on the list.
Yeah, automatic. Somebody with a bullet, like Casey Kasem. Yeah.
But I agree, it was a fun weekend. Certainly here at the Teletheater, we were packed both days. They set a record down at Churchill on the wagering. I read that the NBC ratings were the best since, I think, 1990. So there was a lot of life in this year's Kentucky Derby. And as I say, you did a great job over the 2 weeks leading into it. I know as we talked to you, you're on your way home. So travel safe. And I'm looking forward to listening to the radio this week and getting all of your recap info.
Well, I hope people enjoyed not just my coverage and guests and regulars. Really, Thursday, Friday, I always feel like it ends with a crescendo, and we have so many great contributors, and I hope people did well over the 2 days, and I also hope that nobody comes away frustrated and angered. I see a lot of anger out there. I haven't had a chance to read everything, but this is the game, and those that are looking for consistency, that's a consistent decision in Kentucky. And if you play Kentucky, you know that, and you play the game regularly. Frankly, you probably have had much worse DQs or non-DQs than that. So they're going to run races. They're running races right now. You can get your money back if you're looking to.
Yeah, Steve, again, appreciate the visit. Say hello to Tina, and as I say, travel safe.
Thanks a lot.
Steve Bick, Sirius and XM's At the Races. And there's Steve's thoughts on the Derby DQ and some of the nice stakes action over the weekend. Subsequently, Steve sent some photos from his time down at Churchill over the past couple of weeks, but more importantly, the past couple of days. Marty McGee, Steve's wife Tina, Steve, and Mike Welch, a little congregation with Steve and his wife and the Daily Racing Form guys. A couple of guys, Marty McGee on the left and Mike Welch on the right, who have been on with us here on the network. Marty used to join Mr. Mormino and I think Saturday mornings. We'd check in with him from Kentucky, and then Mike Welch obviously comes on with us up in Saratoga. Also a photo, Serengeti Empress and Tommy Amos. Serengeti Empress obviously winning Friday's Oaks, and look at the expression on Tommy Amos's face. You can tell you win an Oaks or a Derby, it's a very special moment. Also, speaking of special, very special horse for Mike Dubb, World Approval, who looked really good going into the World of Trouble, not World Approval, World of Trouble, going into the winner's circle after his stakes win on Friday. So World of Trouble and Michael Dubb, and then also nice shot of Pat Day in his rain gear. So prominent and really one of the best ever to ride down at Churchill, Pat Day, showing up for Derby Weekend 2019. All right, I'm going to wrap it up here. I want to thank our friends at Woodbine for their sponsorship. Woodbine, pick, bet, and cheer on world-class horse racing north of the border. Also want to thank you. Again, we thought you'd be interested in just getting some thoughts and opinions and some conflicting opinions maybe, as that's the way it is shaking out. If you're checking Twitter or the media, there are mixed opinions on the situation that happened at Churchill on Saturday afternoon, evening with the Kentucky Derby. So we thought we'd bring you a little cross-section of that here on Racing Across America. Hope you enjoyed it. We'll see you next time.
You're watching OTB TV, a service of Capital Off Track Betting.